In December 1835, British military colonel and antiquarian, Richard Howard Vyse, arrived in Alexandria, Egypt, to embark upon a personal voyage of discovery of the country's many ancient wonders, and with hopes of uncovering some of its lost secrets. In his subsequent 3-volume published journal, the colonel tells how he wished to make an important discovery within the Great Pyramid before his return to England. Foremost among his hopes was to find the true burial chamber of Khufu, the king whom Egyptologists attribute with the construction of the Great Pyramid around 2500 BC. Of these hopes, Vyse wrote the following.
January 27, 1837. I naturally wished to make some discoveries before I returned to England. February 13, 1837. I expected to find a sepulchral apartment.
In Vyse's time, it had long been known that above the king's chamber within the Great Pyramid, there was a small hidden chamber. This chamber was discovered in 1765 by Nathaniel Davison, and named in his honor. To access this small chamber required a precarious 25-foot climb, up to the top of the south end of the pyramid's grand gallery, and then a difficult crawl through a narrow passageway. When Vyse arrived at Giza, this small space was being used as the living quarters of an Italian pyramid explorer, Giovanni Caviglia, with whom the British colonel went on to create a partnership to explore the Great Pyramid. But the partnership quickly soured and fell apart. A letter in Tate's Edinburgh magazine in 1837 from Caviglia gives the Italian explorer's version of events, stating that he had confided in Colonel Vyse his views and ideas for exploring the pyramid. Caviglia claimed that the British pyramid explorer had usurped his ideas for his own purposes. It seems that soon after Vyse had learned of Caviglia's ideas for exploring the pyramid, he had a disagreement with the Italian explorer as to the direction of the explorations, and quickly terminated his business arrangement with him, even going as far as to banish the renowned and widely respected Italian explorer from the pyramids. Not long after Caviglia's forced departure, the British colonel began using gunpowder to blast a tunnel upwards above the king's chamber, in search of the hidden rooms Caviglia had suspected may be awaiting discovery. Around a month later, Vyse duly discovered the first of 4 hidden chambers, which he named Wellington's Chamber, in honor of the British military hero, the Duke of Wellington. After a thorough search of the now open chamber, Vyse was disappointed not to have discovered Khufu's true burial chamber. Undeterred, he wrote in his journal,
I still entertained great hopes of finding a sepulchral apartment, and therefore directed that every exertion should be made to get above Wellington's chamber, for which purpose Dode was employed.
From April to May, 1837, Colonel Vyse discovered a further 3 hidden chambers above Wellington's, which he named Nelson's Chamber, Lady Arbuthnot's Chamber, and Campbell's Chamber. The fact that all 4 of these chambers were found to be entirely devoid of any burial of Khufu, or the precious grave goods that often accompanied these royal burials, meant that Vyse, having spent a considerable amount of his own personal fortune, seemed destined to return to England somewhat empty-handed. The only discovery of note that Vyse claimed to have found were some painted wall markings within each of the 4 newly discovered chambers that presented the various royal names of Khufu. These so-called quarry marks were crudely painted upon the chamber walls with red ochre paint. It is believed that when a stone block was cut from the quarries at Giza and elsewhere, the ochre markings painted onto each block acted as a sort of postal address for the installation crew to which the block was to be delivered at the pyramid site. These installation crews, it is believed, would often use the name of the reigning king in their crew names. Names such as Companions of Khufu, Horus Majedu, and the powerful white crown of Khnum Khuf have been found on various blocks of masonry within the 4 Vyse chambers. Curiously, no similar markings have ever been presented from Davison's chamber or anywhere else in the pyramid, including, it seems, the small void chamber, discovered recently behind the large chevron blocks of the pyramid's original entrance. Realizing the importance of these painted wall markings, Vyse tasked 2 of his assistants, Mr. Hill and Mr. Perring, with making copies of them. Mr. Perring would make small-scale survey drawings of the markings from each of the 4 Vyse chambers. A set of these he gave to Vyse for publication in the Colonel's book, but they were also published in Perring's own work, a year before Vyse's account was published. Mr. Hill's drawings were facsimile copies of the wall markings in their actual size, and all 28 of his drawings are now held in the archives at the British Museum in London. In 1845, a Prussian prince, Hermann von Puckler-Muskau, who had met Vyse at Giza in 1837, published his own account of the meeting between the two men, and in that account the Prussian prince effectively accused the British pyramid explorer of faking the painted markings himself, writing,
"The hieroglyphics which Major Vyse pretends to have just discovered in the Great Pyramid are not cut in the stone, but merely drawn on the wall, and perhaps recently too, with a finger, dipped in color."
The accusation against Vyse of perpetrating a fraud inside the Great Pyramid could not have been clearer. But what is the truth of this accusation? Is there anything in Perring and Hill's copies of the wall markings that might point to the truth of the Prussian prince's accusation? A cursory examination of both sets of drawings made by Hill and Perring turns out to be a very revealing and, it has to be said, somewhat disturbing exercise. Let us now consider some of the drawings Perring and Hill made from the Vyse chambers. In doing so, we will highlight some of the peculiar anomalies that they present. In her doctorate thesis, Egyptian Files in the Old Kingdom, Professor Anne Macy Roth theorizes that the builders of the Great Pyramid were organized into different teams or crews. Each of these teams, she proposes, was responsible for building a particular side of the pyramid: north, south, east or west. As part of this labor organization, each of these work crews would have its own particular crew name, and these names would usually incorporate the name of the reigning king into their own particular crew name. Of this organization, Professor Roth tells us,
"In each chamber, the blocks of the north side are marked with one gang name, and those of the south side, with another, while the end walls are divided in half, and the blocks are marked with the name of the gang whose name is on the nearest side wall."
Essentially, each of the Vyse chambers, when being built, according to Professor Roth, would have been split into two U-shaped sections, like we see here. One crew would be responsible for constructing each U-shaped section, essentially a northern crew and a southern crew. The northern crew were known as the White Crown of Khufu, is powerful, while the southern crew were called the Pure Ones of Horus Megiddo. The wall blocks for each U-shaped section of each chamber would be sent to the appropriate work crew to set them in place. It is believed this is one of the reasons the crews painted their crew names onto each of the blocks, ensuring they went to the correct place. As we can see here, there is a common sign to each of the work crews, and it is the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic sign for the word crew. Let us now consider a peculiar circumstance relating to this sign. From the southern wall of Lady Arbuthnot's chamber, John Perring made these drawings of the painted markings he observed there. The markings highlighted here in the red box are peculiar for several reasons. Perring's drawing, as we can see in this enlargement, presents a sign at the bottom right of the sheet, which Egyptologists interpret as the word for gang or crew. This is a fairly common and well understood sign. However, the strange thing about it is that it is the only sign on the wall block that has been painted upside down. Stranger still is that typically, this sign will only ever appear just once in a crew's name, but on this stone block, it appears twice. The sign at the bottom left is also understood to be the sign for the word crew, though here we see that it is presented with an upright orientation. Some have suggested that the ancient Egyptian scribe who painted these markings onto this stone block began the inscription by first painting the upside-down sign. Having started like this, they seemingly changed their mind, rotated their stance 180 degrees, and began painting the name onto the block again. But this makes little sense, since this would mean the scribe, in their first attempt at painting the crew name onto this block, had began by writing the crew name sign, which is always the last word of a crew's name. This sign is always written last, never first. In short, it is very odd indeed that any ancient Egyptian scribe would begin writing any crew name by writing the last word of the name first. However, the most bizarre thing of all concerning this upside-down sign is realized when we compare Mr. Perring's drawing of these block markings with those of Mr. Hill. Here we discover that Mr. Hill, for some odd reason, did not make a copy of the upside-down sign in his facsimile drawing that is clearly observed in Mr. Perring's version. It's simply not there. Was this just an oversight by Mr. Hill, or might there be some other reason why he failed to copy this sign? Official photographs of all the chamber markings have been made by the Egyptian Department of Antiquities, but, unfortunately, none have ever been made available for public scrutiny that would allow us to see exactly what signs are present today on this particular wall block. However, in 1931, Egyptologist Alan Rowe also made a copy of these very same signs, and once again, the peculiar upside-down sign drawn by Mr. Perring is missing also from Alan Rowe's drawing. It's simply not there, and this would seem to be conclusive evidence that the original upside-down sign is now definitely missing from the chamber wall. This suggests that between the time Perring and Hill made their respective copies of these marks, probably no more than a day or two between each, this upside-down crew sign somehow vanished from the chamber wall. And we must surely have to ask, how could such a thing have happened? Was the duplicate, upside-down crew sign, perhaps a false start, made by a modern-day fraudster, who had initially started painting this group of signs onto the wall block upside down, and who, for some reason, changed their mind, rotated their source template 180 degrees, to now copy the signs onto the block upright. Having completed the task, they later returned to remove the false start sign, unaware that all the signs on this wall block had already been copied by Mr. Perring, though not yet by Mr. Hill. Once again, on the northern wall of Lady Arbuthnot's chamber, we find another peculiar circumstance, where a sign was once in evidence, but now appears to be missing from the chamber. On this occasion, the sign in question is the crown sign that forms part of the White Crown crew name, of which there are several in this chamber, as we can see here from John Perring's drawing. On the opposite southern wall of this chamber, John Perring also copied several gang names belonging to the gang, known as the Pure Ones of Horus Megiddo. Important here are two signs, the Megiddo sign and the Horus bird sign. As we can see in the image, each crew's name is restricted to either the northern or southern side of the chamber. In Professor Roth's theory, this demarcation of the crew signs was due to how the labor was organized to construct the pyramid chambers. Consequently, we should not expect to see another gang's name on an opposite wall, nor should we observe two opposite gang names together on a single wall block. But here we observe a peculiar occurrence. On the east side of the southern wall of Lady Arbuthnot's chamber, we find these wall markings. Oddly, this single wall block presents the partial names of not one, but two different crew names, the White Crown crew and the Pure Ones of Horus crew. Stranger still is how we observe that the trailing signs of one crew name and the preceding signs of the other somehow manage to meet in the middle of this wall block and cancel each other out. They're simply not present. Here we can see the signs from each crew name that are missing from the middle of this group of signs. It's almost as though someone began by copying the White Crown crew name onto this wall block, realized this was not the correct crew name for this side of the chamber, and then painted the Pure Ones of Horus onto the block instead, missing out the first sign, the Horus bird, to give the impression of block abrasion. Thus we have two partial crew names on a single wall block, a situation that seems contrary to Professor Roth's hypothesis. The strangest thing of all regarding this group of signs on this wall block is observed when we check how Egyptologist Alan Rowe presents them. In his drawing of these markings in 1931, Rowe completely fails to draw the White Crown sign that Perring has drawn, indicating that this anomalous sign is also now missing from the chamber. Here we have a situation where two signs that are clearly anomalous within the particular chamber setting are the only two signs that have seemingly vanished from the chamber. And we have to ask, did each of these signs disappear precisely because of their anomalous nature? Did their creator know they had made a false start with each of them, and did they come back some time later to remove them, ignorant of the fact that Mr. Perring had already made his own copies of them? Critics, upon learning of these missing chamber signs, simply assert that John Perring, while making his drawings, somehow imagined these anomalous signs on each wall block. While everything is possible, it seems hardly a credible explanation. Just how possible is it that Perring, on two occasions, somehow saw something that wasn't actually upon the wall, and yet somehow, on each occasion, manages to create a bona fide ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic sign, and draw each of them upside down to boot? More likely, if nothing was actually present at these wall block locations, Perring would have ended up with some meaningless scribbles. And it must be emphasized again, These two signs are clearly anomalous signs within the particular chamber setting, which on its own is explanation enough as to why any faker would want to have them removed. Just what are the chances that, of all the painted signs in the 4 Vyse chambers, the only 2 signs that seem to have vanished are also the only 2 that are entirely anomalous? Back once more, to the southern wall of Lady Arbuthnot's chamber, we observe another set of signs that exhibit other curious properties. Notice how, in the 3 highlighted wall blocks, that the bird sign seems to reduce in size as the available wall space decreases. Notice also, how on the lower block, the signs seem to fit perfectly into the visible space, a little window of the block, and how the signs also run in a straight line, following the level contours of the granite floor blocks. This following of the floor contours is seen also in the wall block above left, where once again, we see that most of the signs here follow the angled contours of the granite flooring. These observations suggest that these signs were painted onto the blocks, with the blocks in situ, and not at the quarry as mainstream Egyptology maintains. The question now arises, if these markings were indeed painted onto in situ wall blocks, why were they painted onto the blocks upside down? Surely the most natural thing to do, with a bare wall in front of you, is to paint your name upright. Perhaps what we are looking at here is but a sleight of hand, a fraudster's clever ruse that serves to make these signs merely appear as though they had been painted at the quarry, and therefore trick us into thinking that they must be genuine. Our penultimate piece of evidence in this video, pointing to anomalies in these painted markings, allegedly discovered by Colonel Howard Vyse, takes us once more to Campbell's chamber. Upon the underside of this chamber's roof blocks are painted some ancient Egyptian number signs, representing the values 12 and 11. Here we see the ancient Egyptian sign for the number 10. It's important to understand that ancient Egyptian writing evolved over time, from formal hieroglyphic writing to a more cursive form, known as hieratic. Hieratic writing was generally used for more informal writing, and was used widely because it was quicker and easier than hieroglyphic writing. All of the painted markings in the Vyse chambers are of the informal, hieratic variety, with the sole exception of the numbers, which appear more hieroglyphic in form. As we can see here, the 4th dynasty hieratic form of the number 10 is more angular and pointed when compared to the more rounded and straight hieroglyphic form. It seems odd that we find hieratic script throughout these chambers and then, suddenly, we find numbers that switch to the hieroglyphic form. But this is not the only odd thing about these numbers. When we compare them to a contemporary piece of hieratic text from the 4th dynasty, such as the famous Wadi al-Jarf papyrus, we find something even more peculiar. On the left of the papyrus, we observe a column of hieratic number 12s, while on the right, we find a column of hieratic number 13s. Notice how, in each case, the sign for the value 10 is to the right of the digit signs, the small vertical strokes. This is because, in ancient Egyptian hieratic writing, a word or phrase would always be written from right to left. The same rule applied to their numbers. The highest number sign would always be written first, to the right. And this is precisely what we observe in virtually every other piece of ancient Egyptian hieratic writing. They are, with very few exceptions, written right to left. However, when we compare these Wadi al-Jarf hieratic numbers with the numbers in Campbell's chamber, we find something very strange. The highest value sign, the 10, has actually been placed to the left of the lower value digit signs. It's been written backwards. This left to right orthography of these numbers is the complete opposite to every other piece of hieratic text found within the 4 chambers. Which leaves us with a very peculiar circumstance. How might these odd numbers be explained? As previously stated, the orthography of these numbers appears more hieroglyphic in style than hieratic. The important point to note here is that ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic text could be written from right to left or from left to right. In 1828, several years before Colonel Vyse went to Egypt, pioneering British Egyptologist, John Wilkinson, published one of the very first books on the study of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. From Vyse's known collection of books, it seems almost certain that the Colonel would have had access to and read Gardiner's early work. As early as page 3 of Gardiner's 1828 book, we are presented with these hieroglyphic number signs, written in hieroglyphic form, from left to right. Here we see the hieroglyphic form of the number 48, written left to right. This simple example in Wilkinson's early book would have provided anyone with sufficient information to be able to learn and write the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic numbers 11, 12, 21, and so on. Here then, we perceive a possibility. Could Colonel Vyse, with the help of Wilkinson's early work, have taught himself how to write ancient Egyptian numbers in the hieroglyphic style and from left to right? Is this perhaps why every piece of text within the Vyse chambers is written in the hieratic style and from right to left, with the singular exception of these numbers, because Colonel Vyse knew not the difference between ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic writing and its hieratic form? It has to be said, this type of orthographic mistake is more likely explained by someone not knowing the difference between ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic and hieratic writing. Our final piece of evidence in this video also comes from Campbell's chamber, the last of the 4 chambers to have been blasted open and accessed by Colonel Vyse in 1837. As noted earlier, one of Vyse's assistants, Mr. Hill, was tasked by the colonel to undertake a survey of the markings within all of the discovered chambers, and to produce one-to-one facsimile drawings of the wall and roof markings from each chamber. Mr. Hill made a total of 28 drawings from the 4 chambers, and these can be viewed today at the British Museum in London. What should be kept in mind with this analysis is that we are dealing with human drawings and not mechanical photographs, so there will inevitably be some variance between such media, and even between comparable drawings made by different people. It is not unreasonable, however, to expect that Mr. Hill and others who surveyed these markings would have made a reasonable impression of the key features of each group of signs present upon each stone. We cannot, of course, expect that comparable drawings will be identical in every detail, but neither should we expect to find significant differences between them. As we have already seen, there exist several peculiarities in Mr. Hill's facsimile drawings from some of these chambers, but the most startling anomaly of all is this drawing on the screen here, which is supposedly from a wall block in Campbell's chamber of the Great Pyramid. Mr. Hill writes on this facsimile sheet that this drawing is to be found on a stone on the north side of the chamber. For the purposes of this narration, this drawing will be referred to as Hill's phantom facsimile, and we will see why shortly. Although Mr. Hill does not write the name of the specific chamber which this particular drawing was supposedly copied from, we can deduce that it belongs to Campbell's chamber, which was blasted open on the 27th of May 1837. Had this drawing been from any of the other chambers, then it would almost certainly have been signed by Vyse's witnesses, that Vyse assembled on the 19th of May to verify the accuracy of Mr. Hill's drawings. That this drawing has not been witnessed indicates that it is a later drawing made by Mr. Hill, from a group of wall signs in Campbell's chamber. When we now consider the drawing survey of Campbell's chamber, made by John Perring in 1837, we find that on the northern wall of this chamber, there are indeed 2 groups of signs that appear like those in Mr. Hill's phantom facsimile. In total, Mr. Hill made 2 drawings of similar signs from the northern wall of this chamber. But, as we shall see, all is not what it seems. From a study of all of Mr. Hill's drawings, it appears that he used his signature as a means to record and lock in the orientation of a particular group of signs, as they appeared on a particular block of stone. In short, if we rotate each facsimile sheet to observe Mr. Hill's signature the correct way up, this automatically rotates the painted markings on the sheet to appear, as they are, on the chamber wall. With this in mind, we can now see that Mr. Hill's drawing number 2 aligns with the wall block markings shaded red. But what of the other similar group of signs highlighted here in the red box? Are they a representation of Mr. Hill's other drawing, his phantom facsimile, from this chamber? Let us see. The first thing to notice is that the wall signs in the red box are around half the size of the wall signs in the blue box. But this is not so with Hill's 2 drawings, whereby the 2 groups of signs drawn by him are almost exactly the same size. This is to say, that when we compare these one-to-one facsimile drawings relative to each other, we find there is no significant size difference of the signs in these drawings compared to the 2 groups of signs painted on the wall blocks, which do present a significant size difference. This suggests that we need to find a group of signs on this northern wall that are comparable in size to those in the blue box. Problem is, there aren't any. The next thing to observe is the orientation of the signs in the red box with Mr. Hill's phantom facsimile drawing. As stated, Mr. Hill used his signature as the means to orientate his facsimile drawings to match the chamber drawings. Here, however, we see that he has aligned the phantom facsimile drawing horizontally while the block drawing in the red box has been aligned vertically. This suggests we need to find a group of signs on this wall that has the same horizontal orientation as Mr. Hill's phantom facsimile. Again, there aren't any. But the most striking difference of all occurs when we take a closer look at the actual signs in Mr. Perring's phantom facsimile against those of the wall markings in the red box. The markings here are too small to observe clearly in Perring's survey drawing, but fortunately, Egyptologist Alan Rowe also made a survey of these drawings in 1931 and presents a much clearer set of these wall block markings. Here we observe that the highlighted middle sign is very different between the wall block markings in the red box and Mr. Hill's phantom facsimile. When we search for this phantom facsimile group of signs in the surveys of Perring and Rowe, we find that it simply does not exist. So, on 3 different metrics, we find that this peculiar phantom facsimile drawing of Mr. Hill is significantly different from the only available group of signs in this chamber that it could possibly represent. The scale between the 2 groups of signs is different. The orientation of the groups of signs is also different. And the middle sign of the 2 groups are simply not the same signs. In short, this group of signs in the red box on this wall block of Campbell's chamber is not representative of the phantom facsimile drawing made by Mr. Hill, which evidently must have been copied from another group of signs elsewhere in this chamber. Alas, neither Perring or Rowe observed such a group of signs, and we have to ask, just how likely is it that 2 men could both have overlooked a group of what would be fairly prominent signs, each one being between 12 to 18 inches in height? The question we are then confronted with here is this: how is it possible for Mr. Hill to have made a facsimile copy of a group of signs, ostensibly from Campbell's chamber, when according to 2 independent surveys of the chamber markings, this group of signs Mr. Hill supposedly copied from here are not actually present on any block within this chamber, or in any of the Vyse chambers?
The information in this video is based upon research by author Scott Crichton. These books are available from the publisher, Inner Traditions, Bear and Company, online at Amazon.com, and from all good bookstores.